Chicago rises from the banks of a cold, flat lake like a monument to ambition, a city of towering steel, restless energy, and relentless forward motion. It is a city that has always been in a hurry to be the greatest version of itself. But beneath that grandeur, beneath the architecture and the blues and the deep dish mythology, something else runs through Chicago's veins. This is a city that has burned, a city that has drowned, a city that was built, in part, on the bones of men who never made it home. A city where a charming man with a medical degree turned an ordinary-looking building into something no one has ever fully been able to explain. A city where 844 people, ordinary factory workers on their way to a summer picnic, were swallowed whole on a clear July morning, just yards from shore. A city where the ghost of a girl in a white dress is still reportedly seen on a stretch of highway that leads only to a cemetery. Every city has dark chapters, but Chicago's dark chapters don't stay in the past. They bleed into the present. They wait in the alleys. They surface in the river. They sit on the empty lot where a building once stood, and in the sound of the wind off the lake on a winter night. 5 stories, 5 moments in this city's history that most guidebooks will never mention. Some are well-documented events that left investigators stunned and accountable parties walking free. Some are legends that have refused to die, not because people are superstitious, but because the original mystery was never resolved. Together, they form a portrait of a city that has always kept secrets. You think you know Chicago. You don't. Not yet. Story 1. Absolutely fireproof. The theater had been open for exactly 37 days. Its owners had told the city it was the safest, most modern, most beautiful theater ever built in Chicago. Absolutely fireproof. They said, in the advertisements, in the programs, on the lips of every usher who greeted the crowds. In less than 20 minutes on the afternoon of December 30th, 1903, more than 600 people were dead. And the building itself, the absolutely fireproof building, was barely scorched. The fire didn't kill them. What killed them was something far more disturbing. The Iroquois Theatre stood at 26 West Randolph Street in the heart of the Chicago Loop. It had opened on November 23rd, 1903, and its opening had been met with universal praise. Drama critics called it the most beautiful theater in Chicago, with its grand staircases, ornate foyer, and 3 levels of seating for over 1,600 patrons. The Iroquois was the jewel of the city's entertainment district. It was also, as investigators would later discover in excruciating detail, a trap. By December 30th, the theater was presenting a wildly popular holiday matinee of Mr. Bluebeard, a musical burlesque featuring the beloved comedian Eddie Foy. It was the week after Christmas. Schools were on break. Mothers had brought children. Families had come in from the suburbs. The theater was not merely full, it was overfull. Tickets had been sold for every seat, plus standing room. Some patrons sat in the aisles. The crowd numbered somewhere between 2,100 and 2,200 people in a building legally certified for 1,602. Not a single fire drill had ever been conducted. Not one. At approximately 3:15 p.m., as the second act began, and the stage was bathed in blue-tinted spotlights for a moonlit scene, a spark from a broken arc lamp touched a muslin curtain high above the stage. It was a small flame at first, the kind a single fire extinguisher might have stopped. Lamp operator William McMullen tried clapping it out. The theater's designated fireman, William Sellers, hurled one of the 6 small canisters of dry chemical powder at it. Both efforts failed. The fire had already climbed beyond reach. Stage managers immediately attempted to lower the great asbestos safety curtain, the building's most important line of defense against exactly this kind of event. The curtain caught on a light reflector protruding from the proscenium arch and jammed, leaving a triangular gap of roughly 500 square feet at the bottom of the stage opening. The asbestos curtain, a post-disaster investigation would reveal, was composed primarily of wood pulp mixed with asbestos fiber, a material a chemist would later describe as being of no value in a fire. The smoke vents above the stage were nailed shut. When a stagehand opened the massive rear stage door to allow performers to escape, an Arctic blast of December air rushed in. Within seconds, a fireball, a catastrophic backdraft, tore through the gap beneath the stuck curtain and exploded into the auditorium at roughly 3:50 p.m. It killed an unknown number of people instantly. The electricity failed almost simultaneously, plunging the packed theater into total darkness, the only light coming from the flames. Comedian Eddie Foy had stayed on stage longer than anyone else, pleading with the crowd not to panic, trying to hold the audience steady while performers fled around him. He was widely called a hero afterward, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of 2,000 terrified people surging at once toward exits they could not find. The exits were hidden. Ornamental drapes concealed emergency doors on the north side of the building. Those who found the doors discovered they could not open them. The Iroquois used a European-style bascule lock that required pulling, not pushing, and no American audience member had ever seen one before. When people finally managed to pull the doors open even a crack, the crush of bodies behind them forced others into the gap, jamming the doors open just wide enough for death, but not escape. On one level, an entire passageway that appeared to be an exit led only to a blank wall. 200 people died in that corridor. Fire escapes on the north wall offered another route, but the landing of one fire escape had been improperly installed 2 feet lower than the theater floor, causing a continuous cascade of falling, tumbling bodies. The icy, smoke-choked alley below, a narrow service lane called Couch Place, was so narrow that aerial ladder trucks could not fit inside it. At the base of the internal staircases, bodies were piled 10 feet high. The fire lasted approximately 20 minutes. The Iroquois Theatre itself was not significantly destroyed, yet 602 people were dead, 575 on the day itself, with more dying of injuries in the following weeks. Among those casualties, the vast majority were women and children. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of failures so consistent, so systematic, that the question ceased to be, how did this happen, and became something far darker. How much did anyone actually know beforehand? A fire department captain, Patrick Jennings, had toured the theatre days before its grand opening and reported the absence of sprinklers, fire alarm boxes, telephones, and water connections to his commanding officer, Battalion Chief John Hannon. Hannon told him there was nothing to be done. The theatre already had an assigned fireman. Reporters later alleged that fire inspectors had been bribed with complimentary tickets to overlook code violations, an allegation that was never conclusively proven or disproven. The theatre's own fireman, Salas, had known about the deficiencies for weeks. He had not reported them directly to the fire chief because he feared losing his job. After the fire, 575 manslaughter counts were filed against the theatre's owners, Harry J. Powers and Will J. Davis. The mayor himself was charged. Over 200 witnesses testified at the coroner's inquest. It became a national sensation. No one was ever convicted. Not a single person. 3 years of legal delay, loophole exploitation by the syndicate's attorneys, and failures in the city's existing building ordinances ensured that every charge was ultimately dismissed. A system that had let 602 people die held no one responsible for any of it. Perhaps the single most disturbing detail to emerge from the investigation involved not the fire itself, but what first responders found when they entered Couch Place, the narrow alley immediately behind the theatre, later dubbed Death Alley by newspaper reporters. The bodies were not scattered. They were stacked. Some piles reached 6 feet high. Many victims showed no signs of burns. They had not been killed by the fire at all. They had been asphyxiated by gases or crushed by the weight of other human bodies pressing behind them. A reporter named William Etten described the scene for his paper. The dead lay literally in heaps. Frail women gasped for the last time from mounds of corpses. Puny children sighed their lives away. It was more horrible than war, more terrifying than pestilence. Many of those who had made it out of the theatre had not died from fire. They had died from each other. Chicago's mayor ordered all theaters in the city closed for 6 weeks. Building codes were rewritten, not just in Chicago, but across the United States and in parts of Europe. The Iroquois Fire is directly credited with the invention and widespread adoption of the panic bar, the push-to-open hardware now found on every emergency exit in America. Outward opening exit doors, illuminated exit signs, mandatory fire drills, and asbestos curtain standards were all implemented as a direct result of what happened on December 30th, 1903. The theatre itself reopened 9 months later under a different name, was renamed again in 1905, and operated until 1925. It was then demolished and replaced by the Oriental Theatre. That theatre became the Nederlander Theatre in 2019. A show runs there tonight. The alley behind it, Couch Place, still exists. You can walk it. People do. 602 people died in a building that had been open 5 weeks. Not one person was held criminally responsible. The theatre reopened. The city moved on. And the safety standards that were written, specifically in the blood of that December afternoon, were themselves the product of nothing, more than a building full of families who simply wanted to see a show. The most disturbing thing about the Iroquois Theatre is not the fire. It is how completely and how quickly accountability disappeared. Story 2. The man who built the building. He called himself a doctor. He had the credentials to prove it. He had the handsome face, the soft voice, the easy charm of a man you wanted to trust. He moved to Chicago in 1886, acquired a drugstore, and then built a building across the street. That building has haunted the American imagination for 130 years. And here is the genuinely disturbing thing. Even after historians stripped away the tabloid exaggerations, even after researchers corrected the myths and the invented floor plans and the invented body counts, what remained was still far worse than most people realize. Herman Webster Mudgett was born in New Hampshire in 1861. By the time he arrived in Chicago, under the assumed name Henry Howard Holmes, he had already studied medicine at the University of Michigan, worked in the anatomy lab, been credibly suspected of insurance fraud involving cadavers, married one woman, abandoned her, and married again. He had committed fraud in multiple states. He was 25 years old. In Chicago's Inglewood neighborhood, he took work at a drugstore on the corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street. He was, by all accounts, excellent at the job. Organized, persuasive, charming. He eventually purchased the store. Then, he bought the empty lot across the street and began construction. The World's Columbian Exposition, Chicago's legendary 1893 World's Fair, was coming. Millions of visitors would need hotels. Holmes intended to provide one. What Holmes actually built at 601-603 West 63rd Street was, at its core, a 3-story mixed-use building, retail spaces on the ground floor, apartments and offices above, and, added in 1892 with World's Fair visitors explicitly in mind, a 3rd-floor hotel addition. Holmes financed it through a pattern of deliberate fraud. He hired contractors and suppliers, refused to pay them, replaced them with new contractors who didn't know about the previous debts, and fraudulently acquired goods he never intended to pay for. He did this with people, too. Some of what the tabloids called the murder castle was invented. The gas chamber piped throughout the building, the crematorium in the basement, the 100-room labyrinthine layout designed entirely for killing. These were fabrications published by Joseph Pulitzer's New York World in 1895, illustrated with a fictional floor plan that bears little resemblance to what investigators actually found. Holmes himself recognized that his legend had grown beyond the facts and, in a newspaper confession published before his execution, played to it, confessing to 27 murders, some of which investigators subsequently confirmed were of people still very much alive. But here is what is documented and confirmed. Julia Smythe was the wife of a pharmacist who rented space in Holmes's building. She left her husband and entered into a relationship with Holmes. On Christmas Eve of 1891, she and her 5-year-old daughter Pearl vanished. Holmes offered shifting explanations. She had gone to visit a dying relative. She had fled her former husband. She had died during an abortion. Holmes performed himself. A partial skeleton believed to belong to a child of Pearl's approximate age was later found beneath the building. Emmeline Sigrand was 23, bright, working as Holmes's secretary. She was last seen in December 1892. Her empty luggage trunk was sent to her mother in Indiana. Her skeleton was eventually located through an investigation that included a bone articulator who admitted to having prepared 3 separate human skeletons for H.H. Holmes. Minnie Williams, 24, transferred the deed to her Fort Worth property to Holmes and then disappeared in 1893. Her younger sister Nanny, 18, wrote a cheerful letter to their aunt. "Brother Harry says you need never trouble anymore about me, financially or otherwise. He and sister will see to me," and was never seen alive again. When Philadelphia detective Frank Geyer was assigned to find 3 children Holmes had taken into his custody, Alice Pitezel, 13, Nellie Pitezel, 9, and Howard Pitezel, 7, he traced Holmes's movements city by city across the eastern United States and into Canada. In the cellar of a Toronto rental house, he found Alice and Nellie. Holmes had forced them into a large trunk, drilled a hole in the lid, and connected it to a gas line. Howard's teeth and burned bone fragments were found in the chimney of an Indianapolis home. The true number of Holmes's victims has never been established. At trial, 9 murders were confirmed. Holmes confessed to 27, but several of those victims were demonstrably alive. Historians and researchers have placed credible estimates somewhere between 9 and 50, with higher speculation reaching beyond that. The building itself contributed to the confusion. Holmes employed different construction crews on different sections, specifically so that no single worker ever had a complete picture of the whole structure. Whether this was primarily for concealment of crimes, as tabloid accounts insisted, or primarily to protect his many ongoing frauds from any single worker piecing together the scheme, remains a matter of genuine historical debate. The building did contain hidden rooms. Police confirmed that. What those rooms were primarily used for, hiding stolen furniture and unpaid merchandise, concealing his frauds, or something far darker, was never definitively established through physical evidence alone. Holmes was arrested in November 1894 in Boston, tracked there by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. He was convicted of the murder of his accomplice Benjamin Pitezel, a man he had killed by setting on fire, and hanged on May 7, 1896. Before his execution, he reportedly said that he had taken the shape of Satan, that his face had physically changed, that he was no longer entirely human. Investigators noted that, given his established pattern of compulsive lying on every subject throughout his entire adult life, this statement deserved the same scrutiny as everything else he ever said. What makes the Holmes case genuinely, documentably horrifying is not the Gothic mythology. It is the arithmetic: 3 children, locked in trunks, asphyxiated with gas. Their remains found in the cellars and chimneys of rented houses across 2 countries. Their own mother, traveling parallel to them on a train route Holmes had carefully planned, was told repeatedly that the children were happy and safe, and only a few cities away. The unsent letters that Alice Pitezel had, written from her captivity, letters that were found still in Holmes's possession at the time of his arrest, letters that her mother never received, described Alice's growing confusion and fear at Holmes's strange behavior. She did not know where her siblings were. She wrote to her family, describing a deepening unease she could not name. Holmes had kept those letters. He had not destroyed them. No one has ever explained why. The building at West 63rd Street was set on fire by an unknown arsonist shortly after Holmes's arrest. It was largely rebuilt and operated as a post office until 1938. The site is now a U.S. Postal Service facility. There is no marker. Holmes's execution was carried out at Philadelphia's Moyamensing prison on May 7, 1896. At his own request, he was buried in cement. He stated that he feared body snatchers, which, given his own history of grave robbing during his medical education, carried a particular resonance. His cemetery location was recently confirmed through DNA testing of his descendants in 2017. Detective Frank Geyer, whose methodical tracking of Holmes across North America recovered the children and ultimately sealed Holmes's fate, published an account of his investigation. It remains one of the most quietly devastating documents in American criminal history. Most of what you think you know about H.H. Holmes was invented by a tabloid in 1895, illustrated with a fictional floor plan, and then repeated for 130 years. The reality, the confirmed, documented, legally established reality, is that a man with a medical degree and a charming smile took 3 children away from their mother, one city at a time, across 2 countries, and sent her letters telling her they were fine. The mythology made him a monster. The facts made him something harder to categorize, and in many ways harder to forget. Story 3. The North's Andersonville. There is a neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, a neighborhood of residential streets, churches, and old brick apartment buildings that sits on top of approximately 4,000 graves. The men buried there were never meant to die in Chicago. They were supposed to be exchanged, released, sent home. Instead, they froze. They starved. They sickened in barracks that a U.S. Sanitary Commission inspector, in an official federal document, described as an extermination camp. Most of Chicago has forgotten they were ever there. The ground has not. When the Civil War began in April 1861, the Union Army needed somewhere to organize and train the flood of Illinois volunteers, answering Abraham Lincoln's call. On the flat prairie south of downtown Chicago, near land that Senator Stephen A. Douglas had donated to the original University of Chicago, they established a camp. It was named with an irony that history would render almost unbearable, Camp Douglas, after the senator who had helped create the very crisis that made it necessary. The site chosen was a wet, low-lying stretch of prairie that flooded with every rainfall, had almost no drainage, and could not absorb the waste produced by thousands of men and horses. When the War Department initially selected it, the judge who recommended the location was not an engineer. He chose it because it was only 4 miles from downtown, had access to the Illinois Central Railroad, and was near a reliable water source from Lake Michigan. He did not notice that it was, essentially, a swamp. In February 1862, Ulysses S. Grant's forces captured Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River, taking approximately 12,000 to 15,000 Confederate prisoners in a single campaign. The Union Army had nowhere to put them. Almost overnight, Camp Douglas, still largely a training facility, was converted into a prisoner of war camp, receiving its first 4,459 Confederate prisoners from Fort Donelson in late February 1862. The camp was not ready. It had been built for training soldiers, not imprisoning them. There were no adequate sewers for more than a year. The latrines were open trenches running through the middle of the camp. When temperatures dropped below freezing, the hydrants failed. Barracks designed for 95 men held an average of 189. In February 1863, the month with the camp's single worst death toll, temperatures dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and 387 men died in a single month. Historians note this was the highest mortality rate of any prison camp in the entire war for a single month. Henry Whitney Bellows, president of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, the BIDA federal body responsible for inspecting military camps, visited Camp Douglas in the summer of 1862 and sent a letter to the camp's national administrator. The letter, preserved in the historical record, is one of the most damning official documents of the Civil War. The amount of standing water, unpoliced grounds, of foul sinks, of unventilated and crowded barracks, of general disorder, of soil-reeking miasmatic accretions, of rotten bones and emptying of camp kettles, is enough to drive a sanitarian to despair. The absolute abandonment of the spot seems to be the only judicious course. I do not believe that any amount of drainage would purge that soil loaded with accumulated filth, or those barracks fetid with 2 stories of vermin and animal exhalations. Nothing but fire can cleanse them. Dr. Edward Kitto, a surgeon from the Surgeon General's office, inspected the camp in January 1864. He found 36% of the prisoners too ill to function. He found barracks swarming with vermin because the floors had been removed, an anti-tunneling measure that had the side effect of leaving men sleeping in filth and mud. He found the hospital's 234 beds entirely full, with another 250 sick men still in the barracks because there was no room for them. He concluded the camp was unfit for use. It remained in use. The death toll at Camp Douglas is, itself, something historians cannot fully agree on. Official Union Army records account for approximately 4,275 confirmed prisoner deaths, those whose remains were later reinterred at Oakwood Cemetery in a mass grave after the war. But those same records, when examined carefully, reveal systematic undercounting. Historian George Levy, in his 1999 study of the camp, concluded that official records covered up hundreds of additional deaths, particularly in the early months of 1863. One analysis of the camp's owner, internal tracking, found that between 700 and 1,000 prisoners had simply disappeared from the records, entirely. Not listed as dead, not listed as escaped, not listed as exchanged. Where did those men go? There is no good answer. Some may have been buried in unmarked graves adjacent to the camp that were never properly recorded. Some of the official tallies may have been deliberately underreported by camp administrators who feared accountability. The true death toll at Camp Douglas, across the entire span of its operation from 1862 to 1865, remains, as of the most recent scholarship, genuinely unknown. Estimates range from approximately 4,000 to well over 6,000. What is known is this: Camp Douglas was sometimes called the North's Andersonville, a comparison to the notorious Confederate prison camp in Georgia that became synonymous with deliberate cruelty and mass death. Whether that comparison is fair remains a matter of historical debate. What is not debatable is that between 1862 and 1865, thousands of men died on a patch of Southside Chicago prairie, that their deaths were systematically undercounted, that inspectors who saw the conditions called it an extermination camp and were largely ignored, and that the city was built over their graves with very little ceremony. In the fall of 1864, something happened at Camp Douglas that is among the strangest and most forgotten chapters of the American Civil War. Confederate agents operating out of Canada had been coordinating with Southern sympathizers in Chicago to execute what became known as the Northwest Conspiracy, a plot to simultaneously free all 8,000 Confederate prisoners at Camp Douglas, arm them with weapons stockpiled in the city, and launch an uprising timed to coincide with the November 1864 presidential election. The plan would have turned downtown Chicago into a battleground. Camp Commandant Colonel Benjamin Sweet received intelligence about the plot through informants and moved preemptively on the night of November 6, 1864, Election Eve, arresting more than 100 suspected Confederate agents and their Chicago collaborators before the plot could be executed. The weapons caches were real. The co-conspirators were real. Had Sweet acted even a day later, the city of Chicago itself would have become a theater of war. The men in the camp, men already dying of dysentery, typhoid, and the bitter lake effect winters, never knew how close they came to being used as the catalyst for a battle inside one of the Union's largest cities. When the Civil War ended in 1865, Camp Douglas was dismantled. The buildings were torn down. The land was sold and developed. The 4,275 confirmed dead, those whose bodies were properly recorded, were exhumed and reinterred in a mass grave at Oakwood Cemetery on the south side of Chicago. A Confederate mound memorial stands over them today. The streets of Chicago's south side, Cottage Grove Avenue, the blocks around what is now Douglas Park and the surrounding neighborhood, were simply built over everything else. The neighborhood that stands there today has no marker for the men who died in the swamp beneath it. No memorial for the hundreds whose death was never officially recorded. No monument to the fact that one of the largest prisoner of war death sites in American history sits under an ordinary residential street. The Chicago History Museum holds documentation of the camp's existence. Most of Chicago does not know it was there. Thousands of men died on the south side of Chicago, in conditions that federal inspectors called an extermination camp, and the official records could not account for all of them. The land was sold. The buildings came down. The city grew over the graves like it always does. History moved on. But somewhere beneath those residential streets, some of those men were never counted, never recorded, and never found. They are still there. Story 4, 7:28 in the morning. The water was only 20 feet deep. The dock was only 20 feet away. The ship never left the harbor. It never encountered a wave, a storm, or any hazard of the open water. It was tied to a dock in the Chicago River on a clear July morning, on a day when 844 people, most of them working-class immigrant families dressed for a summer picnic, were going to spend the day together and come home by evening. At 7:28 a.m., with more than 2,500 people aboard, the ship rolled. The SS Eastland was known as the Greyhound of the Lakes. She was fast and elegant, a 265-foot Great Lakes passenger steamer that could reach 16 knots in open water. By the summer of 1915, she had a history that her owners had spent years quietly managing. From almost the beginning of her operation in 1903, the Eastland had exhibited chronic instability. She had listed dangerously while loading passengers in July 1904, requiring fire hoses to maintain order as the ship tilted. Similar incidents had occurred in 1906 and 1912. Naval engineers who had studied the ship understood that she was fundamentally top-heavy, a vessel whose above-deck weight made her vulnerable to catastrophic capsizing under certain load conditions. She had special capacity restrictions precisely because of these concerns. In 1915, following the Titanic disaster, Congress passed the Federal Seamen's Act, new maritime safety legislation requiring passenger vessels to add full sets of lifeboats. The law was sound in intention. For the Eastland, it was catastrophic in effect. Rather than reduce her passenger capacity to accommodate the additional weight of lifeboats, her owners elected to add the lifeboats, increasing the already dangerous top heaviness of a ship that naval engineers had been warning about for more than a decade. On July 24, 1915, the Western Electric Company's Hawthorne Works in Cicero, Illinois, was holding its 5th annual employee picnic. More than 7,000 tickets had been sold. 5 steamers had been chartered. The Eastland, carrying 2,572 passengers, the majority of them immigrant factory workers and their families, was the first to board. Loading began at approximately 6:30 a.m. on the south bank of the Chicago River, between Clark and LaSalle streets. It was a cool morning after recent rain, and many passengers moved below decks to stay warm. By 7:10 a.m., the ship had reached capacity. As boarding continued, the Eastland began to list slightly to the port side, away from the dock. The crew attempted to correct this by filling the ballast tanks with water. The ship stabilized briefly. Then, at 7:28 a.m., it lurched sharply to port. In less than a minute, the Eastland rolled completely onto her side and came to rest on the river bottom. She was 20 feet from the dock. The water was 20 feet deep. Passengers on the open upper decks were thrown into the river. Passengers below, the families who had gone inside to stay warm, were suddenly inside a capsized ship filling with water. Furniture, including pianos, bookcases, and tables, crashed across them in the dark. The portholes, through which some survivors eventually escaped, were only 14 inches in diameter. Rescue began immediately. The crew of a nearby vessel pulled alongside the hull. A Western Electric nurse named Helen Reaper organized and commanded much of the rescue operation on the riverbank. A deckhand from another ship named Peter Boyle drowned while saving passengers. Divers entered the ship as quickly as they could be organized. But the scale of the disaster was already beyond intervention. In the immediate vicinity of the disaster, 844 people died, 20 of them entire families, wiped out to the last member. Among the victims, 220 were Czech immigrants from Cicero alone. The last survivor, a 3-year-old girl named Marion Eichholz, who had been pulled from the river, lived to be 102. She died in 2014. The bodies were taken to temporary morgues established near the river. Because the disaster site was directly across the Chicago River from the Reed, Murdoch and Company building, a large warehouse then sitting empty because the company was on summer break, its first floor was immediately converted into a hospital and identification facility. As the bodies accumulated beyond that building's capacity, the remaining dead were transported to the 2nd Regiment Armory, a massive stone building at Carpenter and Washington Streets on the city's west side. In the days that followed, more than 800 bodies were laid out on the armory floor for identification. Families came. They walked the rows. A reporter who witnessed it described it as the most terrible thing he had ever seen. An entire neighborhood of families frozen in time, laid out on the wooden floors of a military building in the middle of a summer the victims would never finish. Carl Sandburg, then known more as a journalist than as a poet, wrote about the disaster with barely contained fury. I see a dozen Eastlands every morning on my way to work, and a dozen more going home at night. Meaning that the same disregard for working people's lives that had allowed the Eastland to sail existed everywhere, embedded in the city's economic fabric. A grand jury indicted the president and 3 officers of the steamship company, the ship's captain and its engineer. The charges: manslaughter. The indictments reflected the finding that the disaster had been caused by conditions of instability from overloading, mishandling of ballast, and the ship's faulty construction. The ship's builder, Sidney Jenks, was called as a principal witness during extradition hearings for the indicted men. He testified that the Eastland had been designed to carry 500 passengers and transport fruit. He had never conducted a formal stability test. He had never considered what would happen when the vessel was converted to carry 2,500 or more passengers. When asked whether he had worried about this, Jenks told the court, "I had no way of knowing the quantity of its business after it left our yards. No, I did not worry about the Eastland." The court refused extradition. It found the evidence too weak, barely a scintilla of proof, in the court's own language. The reasoning: the company's officers had not been aboard the ship, and the captain and engineer had acted in the ordinary course of business. The ship had, the court pointed out, operated safely for years before. No criminal convictions resulted from the deaths of 844 people, not one. The ship was raised from the Chicago River on August 14, 1915. It was sold to the U.S. Navy, converted to a gunboat, renamed USS Wilmette, and served as a training vessel through World War II. It was scrapped in 1947. The 2nd Regiment Armory, where 800 bodies lay on the floor across 3 July days in 1915, was not demolished. It continued to be used for various purposes across the decades. In the 1980s, it was purchased and renovated by Oprah Winfrey as the headquarters for her production company, Harpo Studios. It remained in use as such for decades. Staff members at Harpo Studios reported, over many years, sightings and experiences that they associated with the building's history. A woman in a long grey dress wandering the corridors, sudden drops in temperature, sounds that had no identifiable source. These accounts are unverified and belong to the category of claimed paranormal experience, not documented fact. They are worth mentioning not as evidence of the supernatural, but as evidence of something else. The knowledge that 800 people laid out on a floor in the heat of July 1915 cannot simply be painted over and forgotten, no matter how thick the coat of paint. The building has since been sold. The spirit of what happened there has nowhere particular left to go. The SS Eastland was 20 feet from the dock. The water was 20 feet deep. Families who had packed their summer clothes and kissed their relatives goodbye that morning never reached Indiana. The ship that killed them was eventually turned into a military vessel and won awards for its service in 2 world wars. The men who built it and operated it were never convicted of anything. The memorial marker at the disaster site was stolen in 2000. Replacement was installed in 2003. 2,500 people were on that dock. 844 of them never made it to the picnic. Story 5. The Girl on Archer Avenue More. Then 90 years of reported sightings. Multiple independent witnesses, most of whom did not know each other, describing the same girl, the same road, the same cemetery, the same ending. She vanishes. Dozens of accounts collected by researchers, historians, and journalists. A police report from 1976. Physical evidence at the cemetery gate that has never been satisfactorily explained. The Chicago History Museum has dedicated scholarship to the phenomenon. This is not a story about whether ghosts are real. This is a story about what actually happened on Archer Avenue and why people are still talking about it. Archer Avenue runs southwest from the city of Chicago into the suburb of Justice, Illinois, a long, flat, tree-lined road that passes through neighborhoods, past taverns and dance halls, and eventually leads to Resurrection Cemetery. The cemetery was established in 1904. It is a large, well-maintained Catholic burial ground, and it is, by every documented account, the origin point and terminus of one of the most persistently reported ghost legends in the United States, the legend of resurrection. Mary belongs. to a category of folklore known as the vanishing hitchhiker. A type of ghost story that appears in multiple cultures across the world. In its most universal form, a traveler gives a ride to a stranger who disappears before arriving at a destination, which turns out to be a cemetery. This template is so widespread that folklorists treat it as an archetypal narrative rather than a singular event. But what sets the Resurrection Mary accounts apart from most vanishing hitchhiker stories is not the legend itself. It is the documentation. The first independently reported accounts of Resurrection Mary date to the early 1930s, when multiple men who did not know each other separately reported picking up a young woman on Archer Avenue near a ballroom called the O. Henry, later renamed the Willowbrook Ballroom. Each description was remarkably consistent. A young woman, blonde or light-haired, wearing a white or pale party dress, dancing shoes, who asked for a ride and, as the car reached Resurrection Cemetery, either asked to be let out, stepped out of the moving car, or simply vanished from the seat. The Chicago History Museum has documented the most widely circulated version of the early accounts, the alleged 1939 encounter of a man named Jerry Pallas at a Chicago dance hall. Pallas's account, which he reportedly gave multiple times over subsequent decades, described dancing with a young woman who was cold to the touch, asking him to drive her home along Archer Avenue, and then watching her walk toward the cemetery gates before disappearing. Pallas reportedly told the story consistently until his death. The question of who Mary actually was, the specific person on whom the legend might be based, has never been definitively answered. Multiple candidates have been proposed by researchers over the decades. A young woman named Mary Bregovy, who died in 1934 and is buried at Resurrection Cemetery. A young woman named Anna Norkus, who died in 1927. Others whose names and histories have been suggested and disputed. The Chicago History Museum notes that the search for a specific historical Mary has been unsuccessful. No single documented death fits all the elements of the legend precisely. Throughout the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, accounts continued to accumulate. They followed a consistent pattern: a young woman, a ride along Archer Avenue, the cemetery, the disappearance. The Willowbrook Ballroom, where Mary was reportedly a frequent dancer, documented the story in its own local history. Taxi drivers reported picking up a fare who gave them an Archer Avenue address and then was no longer in the cab at the destination. In the 1970s, the accounts began to include a detail that pushed the story beyond the conventional boundaries of folklore. On the night of August 10, 1976, a driver reported seeing a young woman standing inside the locked cemetery gates of Resurrection Cemetery, her hands gripping the iron bars. He called the Justice Police. Officers who responded found no girl at the cemetery, but they found something else. Two of the iron gate bars had been bent outward at waist height, and both bars showed what appeared to be burn marks, marks that matched the approximate size and shape of a pair of human hands gripping the metal. Justice Police Officer Pat Homer, who responded to the call, confirmed the physical condition of the gate in interviews given in subsequent years. The gate damage was real. That is documented. The marks were photographed. Cemetery workers attempted to straighten the bars and restore the gate, but the marks remained visible for years. What caused it is not established. Cemetery officials offered various explanations over time. A vehicle had struck the gate. A worker had damaged it with equipment. Someone had vandalized it. None of these explanations fully accounts for the specific nature of the damage. Two bars bent outward at human grip height with heat-consistent marking, but none can be definitively ruled out either. The physical evidence was never subjected to forensic testing that would have established the specific cause. The broader question, whether the Resurrection Mary phenomenon represents a genuine paranormal event, a shared cultural mythology that has influenced how witnesses interpret ordinary experiences, or some combination of both, is not one that can be answered from the available evidence. What can be said is that the phenomenon is unusual in the specificity and independence of its accounts, the consistency of the described location and details across 9 decades, and the existence of at least one documented physical anomaly that has never been fully Explained. Folklorists at academic institutions have studied the Mary accounts as a case study in urban legend formation and persistence. The Chicago History Museum treats the story as a significant element of the city's cultural history. Researchers who have spent years documenting the accounts, including the late Chicago ghost historian Richard Crowe and author Adam Selzer, have found the volume and consistency of independent reports to be genuinely unusual, even when measured against other well-documented vanishing hitchhiker legends. In all the documented accounts of Resurrection Mary, there is one detail that appears with particular frequency and that no conventional explanation has cleanly resolved. The witnesses almost always describe the moment of disappearance the same way. The car reaches the cemetery. The girl asks to be let out. Or sometimes she doesn't ask at all. The door opens. She steps into the road, or she simply is no longer there. And then, the witness looks at the cemetery gates. The gates are locked. They are always locked at that hour. They are always locked. And there is a long stretch of iron fence, and there is no one standing at it. And there is no figure visible anywhere on the road that stretches flat in both directions, with nothing for a quarter mile in either direction that could hide a person. The witness is alone on Archer Avenue in the middle of the night, with the question that every witness carries home and that no researcher has answered in nearly 90 years. Where did she go? The Willowbrook Ballroom, where Mary reportedly danced, closed in 2015. The building still stands. The ballroom held a farewell dance before its closure, and those who attended noted that it felt, in some indefinable way, appropriate that it should end, as though something had been waiting for an ending. Resurrection. Cemetery on Archer Avenue remains an active burial ground. The gate that was bent in 1976 was eventually replaced. The legend has continued to generate reported sightings into the 21st century, at a notably reduced frequency from the peak decades of the 1930s through the 1980s. Whether the reduction reflects changing cultural patterns of ghost storytelling, changing traffic patterns on Archer Avenue, or something else, no one can say with certainty. The Chicago History Museum's documentation of the resurrection Mary legend treats it with the seriousness it deserves, not as confirmed paranormal fact, not as simple fairy tale, but as a genuine and significant piece of Chicago's cultural history. A story that began, most likely, with a real young woman who died too young on a road that led to a cemetery, and whose story was taken up by a city that did not know what else to do with its grief. The most unsettling thing about Resurrection Mary is not the ghost. It is the pattern. Independent witnesses, across 9 decades, who did not know each other, who described the same girl on the same road approaching the same cemetery, and who all arrived at the same dead end. Not a locked door, not a solved mystery, not an explanation that closes the account and lets everyone go home. Just the cemetery gates, just the empty road, just the question that Archer Avenue has been asking since the 1930s, and that nobody has yet been able to answer. She was going home. She never got there, and on some nights, on that long, flat road south of Chicago, she is still trying. Every city carries its dead. Every city has the places it would rather not look at too carefully. The streets that have been renamed, the buildings that have been torn down and replaced, the events that appear in history books but not in tourist maps. Most cities manage the distance between their past and their present with reasonable efficiency. Time does the work. Memory fades. The city moves forward. Chicago has never been able to manage that distance. It keeps closing. 5 stories from a single American city. A theater that killed 602 people in 20 minutes. People whose deaths no court would ever find anyone responsible for. A doctor who moved through a city of millions with charm and false credentials and took people from their lives with a calm that investigators found, in the end, more disturbing than any mythology. A prison camp on the south side that officially counted 4,275 deaths and unofficially may have swallowed many hundreds more, whose ground was simply sold and built over when the war ended. A ship that rolled over in a river 20 feet deep and 20 feet from the dock and took 844 people to their deaths on a clear July morning, after which the men responsible were found not guilty of anything. And a girl on a road who has been asking for a ride home since the 1930s and whom no one has ever been able to deliver there. What connects these stories is not the supernatural. Most of them have nothing supernatural about them at all. What connects them is a city's relationship with accountability, with what it remembers, what it buries, what it builds over, and what it cannot quite make disappear. The fire codes that exist in every theater in America tonight were written because 602 people died in a building that said it was fireproof. The maritime safety standards that govern passenger vessels were partly shaped by what happened on the Chicago River in July 1915. The memory of Camp Douglas's dead has finally, slowly, begun to be excavated by historians who refuse to let the undercount stand. H.H. Holmes's building is a post office now. The Iroquois Theatre's location is a Broadway house. The Eastland's hull was turned into a gunboat and won service medals. And on Archer Avenue, the gates are locked tonight, as they are every night. The road is empty. The cemetery is quiet. The question that has been asked on that stretch of road since the 1930s, whatever it was that question actually was, whatever real event or real grief gave it its original form, is still unanswered. Chicago keeps moving. It always has. That is the thing about a city built on a swamp, on the edge of the largest body of fresh water in the world, in the path of every winter that comes tearing in off the lake. You keep moving or you go under. But the things it has not fully reckoned with, those things are patient. They've got nowhere else to be. If this documentary raised questions you want to explore further, the story of Chicago is still being written. The archives are open. The records are there. And some of the most important research is still waiting to be done.